So I'm going to be making this video on just a topic that's got me kind of, kind of going, kind of angry, hardware, computer hardware. Let's start off with the processors. I'm just going to be reading off this thing I wrote. Let's start off with the processors. Intel and AMD have been on the market for years now, and just like nowadays, they have been competing to see who can get to some major point in the computing world. AMD made the first 1 GHz processor, while Intel argues that they did on a technicality, and back then 1 GHz was near unheard of. Like no computers had that at that time. Nowadays, AMD is building high core count and high clock rate processors such as the FX 9590, 9590, whatever, which has 8 cores and a base clock of 4.7 GHz, while Intel seems to focus on their hyperthreading. Both of these have their ups and downs, where Intel would come in first in the speed at which it could calculate equations for things that need a fast answer, such as games, as hyperthreading can display several equations across several cores, and AMD comes in first with sheer computational output, as hyperthreading only works if a core has extra space for calculations. If a core was at 100% usage, it couldn't possibly accept more calculations. For example, rendering farms and supercomputers would bottleneck, but not in the way gaming computers would. Rendering farms and supercomputers pretty much queue up trillions upon trillions of calculations they need to solve in the CPUs, and then go as fast as they possibly can, which pretty much locks the CPUs at 100% usage, preventing them from doing anything else. Now we get back to the topic I made this for, gaming. I use an AMD FX 9590 for playing games, and I see on the internet nothing but shit for the people who buy this model, or for people who buy AMD in general. But I will get to that later. Intel would come in first in gaming to an extent, as they have hyperthreading allowing faster output of equations, and some models even have their own built-in GPUs, which could add to the frame rate, but since I don't own one, I can't confirm it would. Some of AMD's processors do have built-in GPUs at the cost of less cores and lower clock speeds, but they don't have multi-threading, which would bring them down performance-wise. Now, the reactions of people online. People on the internet are a very special group of people. They are like the ancient Romans. They will hunt down and kill anyone who disagrees with them, even if they are right. I was on a forum yesterday, no connection to ancient Romans, and someone was asking what a good heatsink would be for the AMD FX 9590, AMD's flagship processor that is a massive 220 TDP, which is thermal design power, which is a measurement for how much heat it produces. For anyone who doesn't know, that's a large number. Most of the posts were criticizing the individual for the purchase, saying things along the lines of, "You could have bought an Intel i3 that would beat this," and "This thing will break your motherboard in a month from the heat," and "AMD processors are bad for gaming," and "You should have brought X processor and Y motherboard," X and Y being variables, of course, and no joke, this is directly copied and pasted from the forum. Especially with your ASRock, I don't know how that's supposed to be pronounced, ASRock oboe, which I bet you one scrap metal in TF2, smiley face with tongue sticking out, that it'll fail within a month of use / burn something, usually the 24-pin connector. I think that's just fucking stupid. These were a majority of the posts, by the way, with very little that actually had to do with the original post's question, which led to people having to defend the poor guy just because he bought what he wanted with his money that he earned. Some people even say that he wasted his money. To me, this is like someone buying a table and asking, what's a good ornamental thing, to put on top of it, and people saying, you should have bought a shelf instead, you can put much more ornamental things on it. And I say that without comparing Intel or AMD to a shelf or table, I'm just giving an example. Now, benchmarks are usually a good way to check something's capabilities before you buy them. And as a computer parts consumer myself, I do this whenever I want to buy a new part, sometimes even out of curiosity. As I do play video games, I wanted something that would be able to handle games pretty well, and as I do record games, render videos, multitask among several screens, and even use stuff like 3ds Max, I also wanted something to fill in that need as well. And this processor seemed to displace calculations across several cores instead of Intel's philosophy where they displace calculations over the threads. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different way of getting to the same location, Now, when it comes to price for performance, a common ending statement in benchmarks, they will tell you which one comes out on top, and it seems to be a mix of Intel and AMD, as they are built in such a different way than each other. It's hard to really, discern which one is absolutely better, unless there is something absolutely better. Sometimes AMD is the cheaper option, sometimes Intel is the cheaper option. Now, I mostly brought up and defended AMD, but not as much with Intel. This is because I've never used an Intel for gaming, so I can't say from experience. What do I have against Intel? Nothing. I just never bought one, simple as that. Through my roughly 7 years of playing games on computers built for gaming, I've only ever had 2 AMD processors, both still in perfect functioning order to this day. My first AMD processor came with my first gaming computer, and I already covered the reason for my second. If I could buy Intel, I would. Now, NVIDIA versus AMD. Just saying that incites chaos, so that's why I will say it again. NVIDIA versus AMD. So just like Intel versus AMD, I want to give some background detail before I dive into this. Intel and AMD are 2 companies that produce graphics cards, while always trying to one-up each other. A while back, NVIDIA bought Agaya, something like that, who before that bought Novoday X, something like that. Some weird, name, which meant NVIDIA now has access to develop some fancy particle systems, cloth physics, grass physics, soft body physics, water physics, and amongst those kind of things for their GPUs. NVIDIA seems to have always been about producing some more advanced, and by that, more expensive cards that can do all these fancy little calculations to make games more aesthetically pleasing. Their technologies are proprietary and will only run by default on NVIDIA cards. AMD, however, has their own technologies which are free to use and redistribute, differing from NVIDIA's closed-off fancy aesthetics. This has led to a divide amongst gamers, as one card company can give better aesthetics and one can deliver more calculations. Now to performance. NVIDIA seems to get a higher frame rate with a comparable AMD card. Take, for example, the first iteration of the Titan X, the one released a few years back, not the more recent one. It was neck and neck with AMD's R9 295X2, a dual GPU water-cooled card, which some people call space heaters. On the benchmark that led me to buy one over the other, a Grand Theft Auto 5 benchmark had the Titan X's peak frame rate at 130, and the 295X2's benchmark peaked at 124. They both ran off the same computer, only the cards were physically switched out to compare them, and the settings were, of course, the same. So, 130 versus 124, that's a 6 FPS difference. You may be wondering, well, the NVIDIA card got a better score, that must mean it's a better deal. Not necessarily. As at that time, the Titan X was roughly $1,200 brand new, while the 295X2 was merely $650 brand new, so no broken parts, not refurbished, nothing like that. That's a 6 FPS difference, a very marginal difference at these rates, with almost double the price. So I went with AMD on that one. From the start while playing games, I got nothing but shit from the NVIDIA users saying stuff like, AMD sucks, why didn't you get NVIDIA? And this next one is near word for word, you bought an AMD card? I'm not even going to talk to you. And I swear to fucking Immortan Joe, this individual sounded like they could easily be 12. The few people that actually commended me for buying AMD over NVIDIA were actual college students who were taking classes for and heading into the computer hardware and computer design industry. So going past my choice to buy that, AMD also delivers faster calculations. Again, by saying that, I incite chaos. Teraflops, a calculation that sounds kind of dumb, stands for tera, which means trillion, floating point operations a second. The actual speed of a processor. You may say, but a gigahertz is the real measurement of a processor speed. not necessarily. A gigahertz measures how many times a transistor can switch between 1 and 0 in a second. Giga, I think, would be billion, if I remember correctly. So if you had a computer with 1 transistor and 1 gigahertz, it would be about as fast as a supercomputer from when they first had room-sized transistor computers, which in modern times would be extremely slow. If you had a 1 gigahertz processor that had, let's say, 2 billion transistors, that would be much more powerful, even though they are both 1 gigahertz. A teraflop actually measures how many calculations the computer can perform in a second, instead of how many times a transistor can go between 1 and 0 in a second. That is why some beast graphics cards have a lower clock rate, but can outperform a graphics card with a higher clock rate, as they would have more transistors, lowering the need for a higher clock rate. And that is what AMD does. They have higher teraflop. Well, no, the AMD doesn't do the lower clock rate thing. Well, debatably they do, but it's not what I was continuing on to. Anyway, that's what AMD does. They have a higher teraflops than NVIDIA on average. They have higher actual calculations than NVIDIA on average. The R9 295X2 can perform up to 11.5 teraflops, which would be like solving a long mathematical equation 11.5 trillion times in 1 second, while the GTX 1080, NVIDIA's current flagship, has 10.8 teraflops, which is close, but considering the price difference and the time apart is a noticeable gap, as the 295X2 had come out in 2014, 2 years ago, and the 1080 came out this year, 2016. But if they were released at the same time, it would be more of a neck-and-neck thing. So back to PhysX, NVIDIA's proprietary cloth and particle thing. Some people say that AMD can't run PhysX, which is completely wrong. I have seen a comment on a YouTube video, which is to say, I saw the ramblings of a madman, and the comment said something along the lines of, AMD can't keep up with the sheer amount of calculations PhysX requires, which is completely false. As I already said how, for calculations with a definite answer, AMD would come out on top. By definite answer, I mean how graphics cards work in a different way than CPUs work, as CPUs may double-check a calculation, triple-check, quadruple-check, check 80 times, I don't know, a calculation to make sure there no errors were made, while GPUs are designed to spit out calculation after calculation with less regard to their accuracy, which boils down to the way they are designed on a microscopic scale. Don't quote me on this, as I am not 100% sure on this, but I think that's why some NVIDIA cards come out on top in the benchmarks, as they are better at estimating than calculating, which is what games pretty much run off. The logic is on the CPU and the visuals are on the GPU. There is more going on than just visuals and calculations on the GPU and CPU, but I'm just narrowing it down. I'm trying to put it in kind of layman's terms so you understand. To go back to PhysX and the like, AMD cards can run PhysX. Keyword there is can, as NVIDIA's drivers disable the PhysX option on their control panel, and some games run a little script on the startup to detect if you really are using an NVIDIA card. Some examples of workarounds on both the users and PhysX side would be Fallout 4 and Warframe. I got Fallout 4 to run PhysX on my AMD card by changing a setting in the game's files and making that file read-only, so the launcher couldn't disable it. While Warframe runs something before the game starts that will override the video settings file if the NVIDIA card isn't the main card. In other words, AMD can run PhysX, NVIDIA just doesn't want you to, because that's lost revenue from selling you their cards. To leave PhysX at that, let me go to price. On average, the AMD cards that perform just as well as an equivalent NVIDIA card cost a lot less, which is, if you can remember, the exact argument people made to the guy who asked what heatsink is good for the FX 9590. The same argument. NVIDIA's cards make up the majority of cards that people use to play games, while Intel makes up the majority of processors people use for gaming. So why the hypocrisy? Intel is cheaper and delivers a better performance than AMD. You don't have an NVIDIA card? I'm not talking to you then. Please make up your mind, guys. I have an AMD CPU because it fits my needs in that area, and I have an AMD graphics card because it was a much, much better deal. I have seen so many people on the internet that seem to just go out and buy an Nvidia card because it says Nvidia, and an Intel processor because it says Intel. They do this stuff with no research. Let me tell you from experience, research is the best thing you can possibly do. A while back I unboxed 12 Intel Xeon processors that would normally cost around $4,000 total to get all 12. And I'm not even joking about this. I bought all 12 for $80. That's $80 total. My theory is that they were taken out of an old server that was being stripped down for parts because of an upgrade or lack of support, or something along those lines. Getting something fresh off the production line is nice, but always check for secondhand or refurbished parts. You can save hundreds of dollars on making a good computer. Now, another thing that I am into is overclocking stuff, and AMD's processors usually come out on top in this regard. For example, my first AMD processor, an FX 8120, 8120, however it's supposed to be pronounced, I've never actually heard them said out loud, so I don't know. My first FX 8120 was overclocked to 4.7 gigahertz stable from a stock 3.1 gigahertz. That's another thing AMD comes out on top with currently, but as Intel moves more and more unlocked processors out, they seem to be catching up. To summarize what I have said, Intel, Nvidia, and AMD all have their ups and downs, so if you want to just go out and buy whatever you want with no foresight, whatever, do that then. But if you do actually go out and do that, don't go onto the internet spouting your Nazi-esque arguments with no backup, saying someone is stupid for buying one of AMD's processors, which is pretty much what it boils down to. AMD sucks seems to be the rallying cry for a lot of these uninformed gamers and children whose parents give them too much money and too little attention. So guys, let me tell you, if you do buy something without doing your research and listening to both sides of the argument, go fuck yourself. Have a nice day.